Good evening, sisters and brothers, friends. Welcome to our weekly Bible study here at Bethel. You are welcome to those who are joining us on Zoom and those who are joining us on our YouTube channel. We're going to begin with this song, Sing a New Church into Being. Let us join in as we see fit. Each year, those who are in our prayer ministry produce for our meditation an Advent and Christmas meditation. I'd like to share the prayer for today, December 1st, from this meditation. The meditation today is entitled Good News, and the reading is Isaiah 52 from verse 7 to verse 10. Let us pray. Eternal God, as we live in the gap between our original advent and your second coming, help us not to lose direction, but to remain confident in the fulfillment of your promise. Amen. Brothers and sisters, welcome to this discussion, this conversation. Sorry. I think I may have been muted. Did you hear the prayer? Okay.
Yes, you heard it.
Okay, sorry. Welcome to this conversation this evening. We want to especially welcome those who are joining us from our brothers and sister churches in other parts of the country. We want to very especially welcome our friends from the Buff Bay Circuit of Baptist Churches, along with their pastor, the Reverend Dione Rosemary Duncan, who will be sharing in the discussion and in the conversation. Welcome, Sister Dione, and members of the Buff Bay family, and welcome to all members of the Bethel family. As you have heard in the communication sent out earlier by Brother Lawrence, we have entitled the conversation this evening, Being Church in the Pandemic and Beyond. And we have as our very special guest, sharing in this conversation, Pastor Nathan Nettleton. Pastor Nettleton has been the pastor of the South Yarra Community Baptist Church in Melbourne, Australia, since 1994. He holds a master's degree in liturgical studies, study of worship, and has taught in the area at Whitley College. He's a member of the Baptist World Alliance Study Commission on Worship and Spirituality, and of several national and international ecumenical liturgical organizations. Brother Nathan lives in Melbourne, Australia, with his wife and one adult daughter and 2 dogs. Welcome, Brother Nathan, to Bethel, to Jamaica, in this virtual way. We are very grateful that you have taken the time to join us in this our reflection, our Bible study evening. And
thank you. It's good to be with you.
Trust that all is well. What time is it? I gather you are Thursday morning in Australia now?
Yes, 11 o'clock Thursday morning.
Yes, so you are a man in the future. Well, yes, we are 7 p.m. Wednesday evening. And what's the temperature like in Australia?
It's about 25 degrees Celsius here in Melbourne.
Okay, right. And this time of year, is it what season are you in this time of year?
We're going into summer.
Going into summer, okay. So welcome. So we are grateful to have you sharing with us. And as we indicate, we'll be having a conversation. And later on, members of the community will share in this conversation, either by, if you're on the Zoom platform, you'll raise your hand and you'll be unmuted and allowed to speak. And those who are on the YouTube, you put your comments in the chat, and our brother Lawrence Brown will transmit it to us so we can share together in one conversation, though we're on 2 different platforms. Reverend Duncan is assisting in this interview and in this conversation, not an interview, a conversation. And we are grateful that you have consented so to do, Reverend Dione. Nathan, this is where I'd like to start. We want to hear your perspective on the view that the church was going through transformation long before COVID, and that this transformation was only exacerbated by COVID. If this is the case, how has the church changed and how is it changing?
Yeah, that's a very big question. And I'm not sure that I'm well placed to answer the whole question of whether the church was already going through transformation. I think you could argue that the church is always going through transformation, that churches are always being faced with new situations and new challenges and having to find ways to respond. And there's no question that for churches, certainly in much of the Western world, there were significant challenges facing us before COVID, because we were seeing significant decline in most mainstream denominations certainly in the Western world. I know that for us as Baptists, in my part of the world here in Australia, the Baptists were one of the few denominations that were not in decline numerically, but actually the only reason that we weren't in decline numerically was because of immigration. We were experiencing significant immigration, particularly from Burma, and Burma is an area that has a really high Baptist population, and so we now have a number of large congregations from various ethnic groups within Burma as part of our Baptist Union here in Australia. And if you took all of those recently arrived groups out of the picture, our numbers would have been declining as well. So we can't hide behind the statistics and pretend there was no question there. And opinions on why we are in decline, of course, vary enormously. But one of the things that I think is important as part of it, and that certainly is something that I think has become more apparent because of the pandemic, is patterns of participation. And that is that for many people, they have been experiencing participating in the worship of the church increasingly as almost a spectator activity rather than a participatory activity. That we have that more and more of what goes on in the worship of the church is led from the front by the experts on the platform, and people in the main part of the church are simply watching that and participating to some extent by singing and by giving their amen to the prayers, but feeling increasingly like this is a little bit like what they do when they go to a concert. People might go to a concert and sing along with the band as well. Does that mean they are participants in the concert? No, they're the audience in the concert. So if people have been having that experience prior to the pandemic, what happened when worship went online for many, many churches just made that all the more obvious, because what they were seeing on their screens was live streamed footage, or not always live streamed, in fact, streamed footage, sometimes live, sometimes recorded, of the experts on the stage doing the worship. But people were even further disconnected from it as they joined in with that, because they weren't in the building. And frequently, if it was streamed recorded, they could tune into that at all different times. And so there was really no sense of connecting with a community who were doing worship together. The worship stream became something that was transmitted to them to enable their personal devotion, but not to enable a community event. And I suspect that one of the things that's been going on for some time has been a transition of that people no longer feel like they're really participating in the worship life of the church, and that has alienated many people from the church. And I think with online worship during the pandemic, that became more obvious, but it didn't create the problem. It just made it obvious. You're muted, Glenn, right? I can't
yes,
hear
right. Yes, so thank you for that. With that, I want to go to your specific experience at your church, South Yarra Baptist Church. Tell us a little bit about the church, and then we want to hear a little bit about your transformation from being a gathered community to being mainly an online community. We'd love to hear about that. So we spend a little bit of time talking about that, because that is quite interesting to a lot of us.
Yeah. Okay, so our church was unusual in its worshipping style. It was unusual for Baptists prior to the pandemic, in that we had a style of worship which might be called Bapto-Catholic, or if you're familiar with the teachings of Robert Webber from the Northern Baptist Theological Seminary in the US, he termed it ancient future worship. So it was a style of worship that was informed by patterns from the early church, from a more broadly Catholic heritage of worship. So we had a pattern of gathering, of several scripture readings, of preaching, of prayers of intercession, and then celebration of the Lord's table every week in worship, and then a commissioning of the people to go out. But what was most unusual about that, even prior to the pandemic, was our emphasis on the participation of everybody. So we're a relatively small congregation. We would typically be around 35 to 40 people at worship on a Sunday. And some of what I say needs to be understood against that background, because some of what we do is more difficult to replicate if you had a church of 200 people or something like that, but we can do it because we're smaller. But our pattern was that many of the prayers of the worship service are written prayers, and people had them in a booklet in their hand in the church building. And pretty much everybody who was a regular participant in the worship service would have a section of that they led. And so for most of the worship service, there was nobody at the front on a stage. We were seated in a circular pattern, and voices just came in and out constantly from anywhere in the circle as people reached their parts and led their parts. Generally, the times when there was somebody kind of at a lectern at the front were for the scripture readings or the sermon or a welcome at the start. The rest of the service happened from within the circle. So our congregation was used to having a sense that everybody contributed their voice to the liturgy of the church. And so when the pandemic hit and we had to go online like so many others, the possibility of simply filming a few key leaders doing the worship service and broadcasting that to everybody, it's certainly the easiest way of doing an online worship service. But for our people, they would have simply said, that's not our worship. That's not the way that we worship. For us, we need to be hearing everybody's voices, or it's not really us. And so the challenge for us was to find a way that would enable us to continue that pattern of everybody participating, everybody contributing their voice to the liturgy. And we were able to achieve that by using the Zoom platform as we are today, and by using screen sharing slides with the liturgical texts and music and so on them, in a similar pattern to what we just did before when we sang that hymn at the start, which was a great hymn, by the way. I didn't know that one and I enjoyed that. So yeah, it was simply a combination of Zoom and Keynote or PowerPoint slides. And then a fair bit of work goes into making sure those slides are good. But it meant that what it did for the course of a worship service was simply that the slides are numbered and people can see the number on the slide, and people are notified beforehand what their numbers are. If you've got slides number 6 and 32, when that slide pops up, you unmute yourself, speak what's written on the slide, and mute yourself again, and the next slide comes up, and on we go. Now, quick technical thing. Obviously, there is, as I'm sure you have experienced on Zoom, if you've ever tried to have a group speak in unison on Zoom, it doesn't work. It's a total mess because everybody has a slightly different delay going on in there as they speak to Zoom, depending on their internet providers and where they are, and so on and so forth. So if you try and speak in unison, it's just a horrible mess. So we realized quite quickly that we couldn't do that things that were either spoken or sung in unison, we couldn't do that with the microphones open. And so what we settled on for that was actually using recordings, which is recordings of us. So it's our own voices. We're here, for those of us who are part of the congregation, it almost feels as though it's real because we recognize the voices that we're hearing and speaking along with. But they are actually recordings that we've put together and added to the slides so that those unison parts happen. And people join in with them, but they don't unmute. And so it doesn't create that horrible cacophony that Zoom can do when you all speak at once. So for us, that enabled us to continue the pattern of everybody participating in worship that we had been used to. And we were actually quite surprised at how well it replicated our previous experience from in the church building. And to cut a long story short, I may have to fill in the details when you ask me more questions, but to cut a long story short, over the next 15 months, we continued to refine the way we were doing that and continued to reflect on what this was actually doing to us as a congregation and what it all meant. And ultimately, we made the decision that we would continue this as our pattern of worship into the future, regardless of what happens with the pandemic. The lockdowns have now lifted here in Melbourne. We would be allowed to gather in our church building as normal again, but our congregation has made the decision not to do that. So we have transitioned to being an online worshiping community. We're not entirely an online community because we do actually do other things together, physically gathered. However, there are some limitations to that because over this period of time, we now have quite a number of people who regularly participate with us who don't live in Melbourne. Some of them used to and have moved away and continued to worship with us, and some new people who have joined us who never lived here. And so obviously those people are not able to join with us for other physically gathered activities. So we have a range of other activities, some of which are physically gathered, some of which are online, some of which are hybrid of the two. But we didn't find a way to hybridize the worship experience well. So we decided to make that online only.
So the worship is online only, but
Yes.
there are other opportunities that you use to gather, to deal with fellowship and so on.
Yes.
Right. All right. I think Reverend Duncan wants to come in with a question. Could you unmute her, please?
I'm just wondering if Nathan wants to tell us some of those other activities that are done either hybrid or physical, face-to-face.
Look, I should mention, firstly, in terms of other activities that are still worship related, is that as well as the Sunday service, we now have a pattern of daily prayer gatherings throughout the week. There are 3 times a day, 6 days a week. So there's 8 o'clock in the morning, 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and 9:30 at night. There are smaller prayer gatherings, which have a similar liturgical style, the same technology of matching the PowerPoint slides with Zoom and people having their parts. And we initially thought that might be something that would actually be really popular during lockdowns and then would lose popularity once lockdowns had ended, but it hasn't lost popularity, it's continued. And more than half of our congregation would now be connecting into some of those daily liturgies each week. So that's been a kind of core activity. In terms of physically gathered activities, so a good example, I should qualify this by saying, we haven't been out of lockdown very long. So these are still just getting started again, the capacity to gather physically. And to some extent, it would be fair to say that we're still not quite sure how all this is working for us as a congregation, because the decision was online worship and lots of other activities. But until a few weeks ago, when lockdown lifted, we couldn't do other activities. We've only really experienced adequately one side of it. Last Sunday, first Sunday of Advent, we have over many years had an Advent retreat day where we would gather for about 5 hours on the Sunday. We worship Sunday late afternoon. So our retreat day has been 10 o'clock till 3 o'clock, where there's a gathering for prayer and reflection. We come together with a short opening prayer liturgy. Then we have a passage of scripture to reflect on, and we spread out and find places to prayerfully reflect quietly. And then we come back together and sit in a circle and go around the circle and share anything that we want to that's come up out of the reflection. And then we do a second round of that in the afternoon. We did that last Sunday as a physically gathered event, but we also had the possibility of people connecting into that online. We simply had an iPad set up on a stand in the circle, connected on Zoom, so that the people online could hear what was being said in the room. The people in the room could hear people speaking when it was their turn. So yeah, that was an example of one that we were able to, it was an activity that we used to have prior to the pandemic and have continued. And it was just interesting thinking about someone connecting in from a distance on that, because that was certainly possible prior to the pandemic, but we wouldn't have thought of it prior to the pandemic. The idea wouldn't have happened. And so it's a good example of how we've actually been able to be more inclusive because of what we've learned during the pandemic. Someone who couldn't have been there before was now able to be there. And people's not being able to be there can be for any number of reasons. Like sometimes it's because they don't live nearby. Sometimes it's because they are frail and elderly and don't have the mobility to get out and get places. It can be for all sorts of different reasons. For some people too, they might physically be able to get there, but the online can work better for them for reasons of other kinds of disabilities. So for example, we've got a couple of people with hearing impairments who find that they actually prefer online because they can control the volume at which they're hearing things. Whereas when they're in a room and people are speaking without microphones, they've got no control over the volume and they can't hear a lot of what goes on. So even though physically they could get there, they hear better and can participate better in the online setting. I've also noticed there are some people who have kind of significant social anxiety disorders and things like that, who actually will feel incredibly anxious in a room of people, but can cope okay with a screen of people. There's a different dynamic. So it works for different people. Other activities, there are a number of social activities. This coming Sunday afternoon, one couple in the congregation have just said, we're having an afternoon tea at our place, which is vaguely to celebrate the anniversary of the birth of C.S. Lewis, because it's roughly his birthday around now. So we might have a couple of readings from C.S. Lewis, but really it's just an excuse to catch up and chat and have a coffee together. So there'll be a group of people gathering to do that. A couple of weeks ago, a group of us formed a team and went to a trivia night that was a fundraiser for a project that we have supported as a church here in Melbourne. And we went and participated in the trivia night together. So yeah, a lot of those activities won't involve the whole church, but the invitation is there to the whole church, and whoever wants to come, comes. Yeah.
Just one other thing, Nathan, and then I'll allow Reverend Leila to come back in. In terms of online, how do you facilitate fellowshipping online? So outside of the face-to-face, physical, hybrid, when you have online church, how do you facilitate that element of fellowshipping?
I think this is what our politicians call a Dorothy Dixer question, a question where you know the answer, but you're wanting to get it into the room. So, and Dione knows the answer because she has visited our church a number of times and has preached for us. Yeah, so at the end of our Sunday worship service and also at the end of each of our daily prayer liturgies, we have an opportunity for people to stay and chat with one another. In the Sunday liturgy, where it's bigger numbers, you'll be aware that it's very hard to just have a social chat with a group of 40 people online, because it just doesn't work with the way the microphones work with Zoom. We use the breakout rooms feature in Zoom to just automatically put people into groups of kind of 4, 5, or 6 screens at the most in each group. So that they can chat. And in that Sunday one, those that will last for 8 minutes, and then we reshuffle the groups and they go with another group. And so often there'll be 3 or 4 rounds of those small groups in breakout rooms. We've actually found in some ways it's more effective than anything we used to do in the church building in terms of getting people to mingle, because people can't just sit with their friends and stay with them the whole time and never talk to anybody else or anybody new or anything like that, because the groups are being randomly shuffled so that they will end up encountering people that they might otherwise have not sat with and talked with. And so that's been quite effective. After the daily prayer liturgies, there has also been that opportunity to chat, but those the daily prayer liturgies are usually smaller, so we don't need to use the breakout rooms function to break that up. What we do with at the end of each daily prayer liturgy is there's firstly an opportunity to just go around and for each person to share something that's important for them at the time, which might just be, oh, this is what I think I'm going to do today. Or it might be, you know, during that Bible reading that we just had, I was really struck by this thought, and share a thought. It can be a whole range of things. So each person is invited to share something uninterrupted first, and then we just open it up to a more general conversation. When we first did that, it was, early in the first lockdown, and we realized that for people who not experienced lockdown, an opportunity to chat with one another was going to be really important. And so the idea of coming together to chat actually was the beginning of the idea. Then we decided to join that with the daily prayer liturgies, and it worked really well, and it's continued. So yeah, there's always that opportunity for people to chat afterwards, and that's been really important.
I did say I'd allow Reverend Lila to come back in, but one other thing, Nathan, and we have talked about this, but I'm sure persons who might be interested in hearing, how do you treat with the Lord's Supper, given our Baptist understanding of the Lord's Supper and having church online fully? How do you treat it?
Okay, so big question, and I do just want to check with Glenroy. Do you want me to go with that question now? Because you had it on your list. And
yes, because someone in the chat has it as well. I see a question in the chat. So it seemed to be quite a question that persons need answer on. How do you, if the Lord's Supper is about embodied gathering, how do you do that online?
Yeah, look, it's a really good question, and it's quite a controversial question. I have, because of my area of liturgical studies, that is mostly kind of ecumenical conversation. So I'm aware that different denominations have handled this question very differently from each other, and that usually reflects different Eucharistic theologies anyway. So there are a couple of questions involved in it. Firstly, to say, yes, we have been celebrating the Lord's table online pretty much from the start, and we celebrate that every week, as we had done in our church worship before. And the way that we do that is much the same as we do the rest of the worship. There is a lengthy prayer that introduces our sharing of the bread and wine, and that prayer is led by lots and lots of voices from within the congregation. And then people will see on screen me breaking the bread and pouring the wine, and calling them to share, and everybody will have with them their own bread and wine or whatever they choose to drink at the table. They will have that with them, and will share that at that time. Now, so that's the nuts and bolts. In terms of the theology of that, there are a number of questions that come up, and those questions vary depending on how people understand this. So for many denominations, the question has been one about ordination. Can we celebrate the Lord's table if there isn't an ordained presider in the room who, sometimes we Baptists can be a bit facetious about the Catholic views and say an ordained presider who does the magic in the room to make the bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. And so in Catholic teaching would be that, no, there needs to be an ordained presider present because something happens to the bread and wine that only that person can do. That view has not been a common one among Baptists, and it's not been my view. My view, and it is an area that I've researched and written on in a number of places, is that a Baptist understanding says that rather than the important thing being the ordained status of a single presider, the important thing is actually the baptized and gathered status of a community. It is as a community that we bring about this sacramental reality, not something an individual does. Baptist theology has always been much more communal, congregational. It is us as the gathered body coming together around the table who are able to do this. So I've sometimes in conversations with some of my Roman Catholic friends said to them that for them, the question, like they have a practice sometimes of a priest conducting a mass with no congregation present, because there used to be a teaching in the Catholic Church that a priest had to celebrate mass every day. So they would do it by themselves with nobody present. And that would be regarded as valid. And I've said to them, from a Baptist point of view, we would actually argue that that was an invalid sacrament because of the absence of a congregation, whereas you might argue that ours is invalid because of the absence of an ordained priest. But that's kind of where the difference is between a Baptist and a Catholic view there. What's missing, an ordained priest or a gathered baptized congregation? So having said that, that does bring me back more squarely to your question, and that is, what does it mean to be a gathered congregation if you're online? Can this be regarded as a gathered congregation? If this sacrament is an embodied event, are we embodied when we gather online? So my solution to this won't be popular with everybody, but I'm actually really doubtful about whether communion should be celebrated in a recorded and streamed liturgy. So if you are simply recording some people doing communion in the church and then streaming it to people who might watch it at all different times, I'm doubtful whether you can say that you have gathered a congregation if people are, in a sense, consuming this broadcast at all different times from all different places. But I think that's different to what we are experiencing at the moment, because what we are experiencing right at this moment is actually a live event. We are all here at the same time. We're talking to each other live in real time, even though it might be 11 o'clock Thursday here and 7 o'clock Wednesday, where most of you are. We are still in a live event. And so in a sense, we are gathered. We may not be physically gathered, but we are actually gathered in one another's presence, able to interact with one another and engage with one another. And I think that for us as followers of a risen Lord who kind of broke all the boundaries of what it meant to be in one place at one time in his resurrection experience, a risen Lord who appeared through locked doors and various such things, who is always gathering us into his one body. But when we talk about Christ gathering us into one body, we don't mean into one physically gathered place. We can be gathered into the body of Christ from Jamaica and Australia simultaneously without us having to relocate to do that. So I think our understanding of what it means for Christ to be risen and ascended and everywhere present enables us to be gathered as one body in disparate locations, but we need something that enables us to be actually gathered in a way that is connecting us to one another in real time.
So you wouldn't have your communion on YouTube? Is that what you're saying? You wouldn't use YouTube? Or...
Yeah, look, we do provide, there's a recording of our service provided on YouTube, but we would not be encouraging people to see that as participating in the Lord's Supper if they're watching that. So it's put up there afterwards, but we kind of very clearly say on it that, you know, this is just a recording that you are watching now. This is not participating in the worship service. If you want to participate in the worship service, you need to turn up at 5 o'clock on Sunday on Zoom. Yeah.
In your worship event, people are on Zoom.
Yes.
And they're in different places.
Yes.
Is there a requirement, any kind of, do you say, for example, everyone should turn on their camera so we can see you? Is that something that you encourage?
It's something that we encourage. We don't, it's not an absolute requirement, because sometimes people may have constraints like inadequate data and if your camera is on, it uses more data. So if people don't have a very good data supply with their internet provider, they may need to turn their cameras off. But yeah, we ask people to put their correct name on the screen and preferably to turn the camera on.
Right. Yeah. Okay, there are some questions. We're going to take them now. I see Kevin or Natalie, and then Lawrence, you will come in with the others.
Pleasant good night. Welcome. Thank you for being here. I have a question and a comment at the end. So my question quickly is, do you have a large or significant youth participation or population in church, an online church? What have you found or seen or noticed with regards to their participation compared to maybe the participation against of some of the other members? And the reason why I ask is, you mentioned that you guys, started out by just having set times for conversations, and out of these conversations, other things started to emerge, and then you have this regular meeting that includes prayer, etc., etc. And I'm interested to also, find out, how some of those conversations went. What are the kind of age ranges you get at the different times of the day? And so that's my question. My comment is, I'm actually in agreement with you in terms of how, I'm not a theologian or anything, but I'm in agreement with you in terms of how you, perceive being there live in terms of the sharing of the sacrament. If you're not there live and it's just a recording, you're just looking at a recording to maybe edify yourself. But if you are there live, you are kind of participating at the same time. And it is a breaking down of the barriers. If we look at Jesus Christ and his time here on earth, a lot of barriers were broken down. A lot of things that at that time was seen as convention. Jesus came and kind of upset the apple cart and said, hey, we're dealing with a new covenant now. And this new covenant requires things that are different from what we used to do. And so if we are to, I think, respond in the way that maybe we are called to respond, it's being forced to operate and do some of the things differently than we used to do in order to reach the members in the way that we need to, given the constraints and opportunities, I might add, that the pandemic has raised. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, look, in terms of the question about youth, no, we don't have a significant youth contingent in the church at the present time. We're not a very big church anyway. We're only a church of about 40 people. And for most of the time I've been pastor here, we actually had a fairly even spread of ages, but in the last 5 or 6 years that has shifted. We lost a number of our youth, none of them because they were disgruntled. It's just that they moved away with jobs or various things. And at the same period of time as we lost a number of our younger people, a number of the new people joining the church seemed to be older people. And so our age demographic has skewed to being an older group than it was. There are still, we still have a couple, we have 3 people in their 20s, I think. We've got no teenagers at the present time. We've got some primary school age children and the primary school age children are very active participants in it. They have lines that they lead in the liturgy too, and they're very proud of leading their lines. But yeah, we don't have a significant youth contingent, so I can't comment on how that works for them. My sense is that it really varies, that some young people, their expectations are very much shaped by the entertainment culture around them, and they want something that replicates that, something that is loud and dazzling and spectacular and exciting. And there are an equal number of young people who actually react against that and say, I have plenty of that in my life. For worship and spirituality, I need something that is entirely different to that. And they are much more drawn to silence and reflectiveness and so on. So young people's desires and expectations can vary enormously. And our style of worship might appeal to those who are looking for more silence and reflective structure. It's not going to appeal to those who want dazzling, hypnotic, high-tech entertainment.
Lawrence, yeah, Lawrence.
Yeah. Okay, greetings everyone. On the Zoom platform, there are no unanswered questions.
Lawrence, your voice is very soft.
Yes, on the Zoom, hear me any better?
Yep.
Right, on the Zoom platform, there are no unanswered questions. On the YouTube channel, there's a question from Reverend Rosalina Robinson. Would you say real time is an important element to have? And I think this may be related to what you were discussing already about the Lord's Supper, the Eucharist.
Yeah, look, I think that real time makes the difference between doing something as a community and doing something as a private act of devotion. Now, I think this is one of the things that perhaps we have become more aware of because of the experience of online worship during the pandemic. But I think it's a division that was always there. There were always people who regarded the liturgy primarily as something that they did communally. They connect with other people, and together we bring an offering of worship to God. There are also people who connect in a much more private and devotional way, who actually experience the liturgy of the church as an aid to their personal devotion, their personal connection with God. And you can often see that, you can see that the differences in that those styles. It's very noticeable with communion that some people have a very much a me and Jesus attitude to communion. I come to encounter Jesus myself, whereas other people have this sense that I come to be part of a body that then encounters Jesus. If you listen to people complaining about worship, you will hear some people say, I didn't get anything out of it today, and other people who will say, I didn't feel part of it today. And that tends to reflect those different mindsets of, one, what did I get out of it versus was I part of something that happened? So I think those differences have always been there. being occasionally a little bit of a kind of fundamentalist about my liturgical ideologies, I lean towards the communal. I think that the idea that liturgy is the work of the people, that it is something that we come together to do and to bring to God as a group of people is really important. And for that, I think that the real-time connection is important. There's no question that a recording of a worship service can help as a devotional aid for somebody who is doing something by themselves, but they are essentially doing it by themselves. And that's a different thing. It's not wrong, it's just different.
There are two more questions. Can we call the online community an embodiment in a real sense? So can we call the online community an embodiment in the real sense? And the other one is just somebody asking, can I have a bit more detail with the type of bread and wine used?
Okay. All right. Let me start with a hard one, the embodiment one. There's no question that the online experience sharpens this question. Are we really embodied if we're not in the same room together? However, I wonder whether the same question can't be asked when we are in the same room together. Is the person who sits at the back away from everybody else, or maybe if they have to sit at the front to be away from everyone else, I'm not sure, it depends on the culture of your church. But if they sit in the place that nobody else wants to sit in the church and separate from everybody else and are kind of engaging with the worship service at a personal devotional level rather than as a sense of connecting with the rest of the congregation, does that question about embodiment still stand? The fact that they're in the same room, does that really change it? Or is it actually something about how we participate with each other? The psychologists who study loneliness sometimes say that the loneliest place in the world can be in the middle of a crowd. The fact that you are surrounded by other people does not necessarily mean that you are engaging with them in a one-body way. You can still be very disconnected when surrounded by people. So I think that that our intention is actually more important than our physical proximity. I am intentionally with you today, answering your questions in a live way, connecting with you as part of the body of Christ. That's a very different experience to if I had recorded a 30-minute video of my thoughts on online worship and just sent it to you to play. We are connecting as a body in a different way. So I do understand the question, and I do realize that it's quite complex. But to me, I probably put more emphasis on the word gathering than I do on the word embodiment, though I think both are important. But I feel like that actually gathering with one another is the primary precondition for any kind of embodiment. And my experience of gathering like this is that I feel like I've really gathered with you. I don't feel like the fact that I'm on the other side of the world from you, this technology has enabled us to connect in a way that I experience as real community, real body. The question about bread and wine is, so if I understood the question correctly, it was what sort of bread and what sort of wine do we use? And of course, the answer, having gone online, is it's whatever sort of bread or wine the person chooses, which has been quite liberating in a way, because we used to have these issues around, okay, so we've got someone in the congregation who has celiac disease and so can't eat anything that has gluten flour in it, or we have people with different, we had someone in our congregation who couldn't drink the wine, not because of the alcohol, but because she was allergic to grapes. So even non-alcoholic grape juice was not possible for her. And so we had to find other solutions. So going online has made it very easy. We encourage people to provide their own bread and wine or whatever they're going to drink. And they do, and they provide what works for them. So we're not seeing it as it all has to be. I do know churches that have taken the approach of having one loaf at the church that is then broken up and distributed around the households of their congregation. That wouldn't be logistically possible for us because we have some people who connect in from other parts of the country or even other parts of the world. So we couldn't do that even if we wanted to. While I do understand the symbolism of that, of the sense of all eating from the one loaf, I also think that what Christ does in bringing us together as one people enables those various bits of bread to be gathered together and to be one loaf that unites us. I don't think that's absolutely ideal. I still, there's a big part of me that still wishes we could be gathered in the church on Sunday, celebrating the service together, all in the one room. But as there's someone in my congregation who is always saying that he wants us to do that again. And he always says, but surely all things being equal, you'd prefer to be physically gathered in the church, wouldn't you? And I say, yes, absolutely. Now, what is your plan for making all things equal? And he doesn't have a plan, so we can't do that. So there are compromises in this, but the compromise the other way is we go back into the church building and nearly half of the congregation is missing because they can't be there. So how is that any better?
Thanks. Yes, there's some. Okay, one is, did your tithes and offering increase or decrease over the period of online worship? And there's another one which says, would you say that what is happening to the church in this pandemic is a movement of God?
Okay, so tithes and offerings, ours went up a little bit, but that was actually mainly because the congregation went up. So that went up proportionally. We now have more people regulate worship than we had before the pandemic, and tithes have gone up with that. But I must add that we didn't actually pass the plate round in the worship service before anyway. Most of our congregation were already doing their financial giving online. And so that was not a difficult transition for most of our people. There were a few, we did have an offering plate in church, but it was by the door and people could put money in it. But we didn't pass it around in the service. So it was not kind of a part of the action of the worship service. So that meant, for us, it wasn't such a big change as it would be for a church that primarily did their tithes and offerings through a plate in the worship service. Sorry, what was the other question?
Coming up, the other question is, would you say that what is happening to the church in this pandemic is a movement of God?
Yes. That doesn't mean that I think the pandemic is a movement of God, but I think that God enables us to respond to terrible circumstances, and that God is always moving in the midst of whatever the circumstances are. And the call to us is to get caught up in whatever God is doing at the time. So I don't think that every response to what has happened in the pandemic in the churches, I don't think every response has been a good one, but I think that God is with us, and that sometimes, even when we make terrible mistakes and do things badly, we learn from one another and we grow together and we find new ways forward. And I think that God is always with us in that. And so, I certainly don't think that what my church is doing is what everybody should be doing. As I said at the start, I don't think you could actually do what my church does if you had a church of 200 or 300 people. It just doesn't, the dynamic doesn't work the way we do things for a bigger group. You could do another version of it. You'd have, but this is why, one of the strengths of our Baptist understanding of church is that we don't think that God has a one-size-fits-all model. We think that God engages with every congregation individually, and God leads us as a congregation to find the pathways for us. That's why we practice congregational government. It's not because we believe that every congregation has the right to be wrong in its own stupid individual way. It's because we believe that God leads us each in different ways.
I want to ask, we've been talking a little bit about the church and being authentic church. I think you have addressed the matter of worship and how your church manages to worship in the online space. You have addressed the matter of fellowship, how they manage to do fellowship together. And I think to some extent, discipleship, how people are growing together with the groups that you have on a daily basis. What about mission? How do you do mission or engage in mission in this online space? And adding to that, we recognize two sacraments: the Lord's Supper, Eucharist, which you have spoken to. Mm-hmm. How about baptism?
Okay. All right, let me start with the baptism one. So one of we haven't had to solve it yet because we haven't had a baptism in our congregation since this began. So we haven't had to address it directly yet. However, the answer would be that although we are gathering for worship online, that doesn't mean that there can't be some groups that gather in smaller groups and connect into that worship service online. So there will normally be in our worship service some screens that have multiple people in them. Usually that's because it's a family unit. But now that lockdown is over, sometimes we will have members of the congregation who will visit other members of the congregation and join in worship together. So we might have on one screen 3 or 4 people sitting here on a couch that are from 2 or 3 different households and have come together to participate in the worship service together. So if we were doing a baptism, that would mean that what we would actually do would be, there would be a slightly larger gathering somewhere around a baptismal pool, and maybe there are 6 or 7 people there who are part of the congregation who do that baptizing, but it is part of a live worship event that is happening on Zoom. So they are one of the screens, and they would be spotlighted at the time of the baptism so that everybody could see them clearly. But there would be a group there from the congregation. Now that, of course, is dependent on us not being in lockdown at the time, because when we're in full lockdown, we can't visit each other and come together like that. In which case, I guess we would have to postpone the baptism until we could. But that's our intention at the moment. If we were doing a baptism, there would be a small group come together and connect into the service from the baptismal pool. Your other question was the mission question, yeah? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Look, this is, it's a difficult question to give a simple answer to, because mission is so varied. What does mission look like? Sometimes mission looks like a soup kitchen for a group of homeless people. Other times it looks like an evangelistic Bible study. Other times it looks like running a housing program or something. These are all very different things. For our particular congregation, questions about how we do mission have been a problematic question for a long time, long before the pandemic. The most negative view would be that our church doesn't do very much missionally. However, we have quite a lot of individuals in our congregation who are very actively involved in different forms of mission in different places. And so one of the things that has been important about our church is recognizing all these various areas of mission that people are involved in, and blessing them and equipping them and nurturing them to be able to do that. And that's continued to be the case since we've gone online. At the same time, there's a significant kind of online mission that develops out of this. To some extent, we had some online mission already because some of you may be familiar with the Laughing Bird website, which comes from our church and provides worship resources. I'm pretty sure that's how Dione first knew me. And so that too has continued, but now as we have been doing more things online, more missional possibilities come from that. And some of them are about helping support and equip other churches with the challenges facing them. You know, you could argue that what I'm doing right at this moment is actually a form of mission. I'm sharing with the wider church some of the fruits of our experience. Okay. And hopefully some of that will be a benefit to you.
Okay. Brother Earl?
There are a couple of hands up.
Yes, Brother Earl, go ahead, and then Sister Dione, yes.
Yes, I'd love to ask this question. Is the decision to go online only for your worship services, is this likely to be reviewed anytime soon, or is it an irrevocable decision at this stage?
I don't think there's any such thing as an irrevocable decision in a Baptist church. Everything can be reviewed. But the decision it's not been a time-limited decision. It was for a while. So during the first 15 months, there were points during that time where lockdown lifted here in Melbourne, and we could have gone back to worshipping in the church. And at those times, we made a decision that we would continue online while we were working through these questions. And that was partly just because we recognized that in some of those earlier periods between lockdown, it was not actually very easy to just go back into the church. There were so many new restrictions and things that needed to be done if you gathered in a church that it was harder work to go back than it was to stay online. There were all these requirements about how you had to clean everything in the church after every gathering, and keeping records of everybody who came through the door, and setting the seats out so that you sat further apart from each other than before, and wearing masks and all kinds of, and for a while here in Melbourne anyway, you weren't allowed to sing in a church because singing projects too much air out and was a big risk factor for COVID. So we were just looking at it going like, it's actually so difficult to go back into the church that we will continue online until we've worked out what happens next. And so at those times, the decision was temporary. You know, we will stay online for at least another 3 months while we sort these questions through, or things like that. But yeah, earlier this year, we made a decision as a congregation that our future pattern would be worship online and other activities physically gathered. And yeah, that decision, I guess it's permanently under review. We could at any point, somebody might come to a church meeting and say, we need to undo this. And that will be a discussion that could be had. But it's not something that has a regular kind of, we will reconsider this every 12 months or something like that. It's a decision for the long-term future.
Dione?
Nathan, it's a step back to a question asked earlier, and the answer you gave triggered something. When the question was raised about youth, the presence of youth in your congregation, in your answer, you spoke to how youths could be there but have different needs in terms of worship.
Yeah.
So it triggered the question.
Hey, Maureen, go.
So it triggered the question for me as someone who trained in liturgics, and that's your area, your field. How how do you respond to the different instincts, worship instincts present among worshipers, and how do those inform you each week as you plan worship? Because there are those of us who plan worship and we have this wide range of, different, not just age groups, but persons at different stages and with different needs. So the question is how the different instincts inform your planning, if any at all, and how you respond to those different instincts present in the congregation. Thanks. Not a hard one.
That's a really good question, Dione. It's and I feel a little bit exposed by the question, because I feel like it's a question that goes to a point where I know that I am conflicted and even a bit contradictory within myself. So on the one hand, I don't like the idea of churches breaking up into groups that cater to every different taste. And so we have this service for this group of people, and this service for this group of people, and this service for this group of people, and those groups never overlap. I don't like that, because I think that reconciliation is at the heart of what it means to be the Church of Jesus Christ. And if we can't learn to get along with each other and do things together, then at some level we are missing the point of what it means to be the Church of Jesus. On the other side of my internal conflict, I actually think that trying hard to cater to every taste in the one worship service does not usually produce very satisfying worship for anybody. And you can end up with something that feels very disjointed and fragmentary and just annoying to everybody. And so I generally think that it is better for churches to decide on a style and follow it through, and to recognize that another church down the road will be doing something different, and you might lose a few people to them and they might lose a few people to you, and that's okay. That if everybody's trying to be everything to everybody, we end up with a whole lot of churches that all look the same and none of them actually look any good. They're just, you simply can't do everything well at the same time. So I guess in terms of my own church, we have a liturgical style. It's very clear that is our style, and that is who we are, and that is a key part of our identity and part of what people connect with when they come to us. And it won't suit everybody. If you're after loud rock music praise band, you won't find that in our church. That's not us. I'm not opposed to that. I love it. I'm kind of exactly the generation that produced that style of worship, and I can still really, really enjoy that kind of worship, but it's not what my church is doing. And I don't think that we need to try and pretend that we can do that as well. We don't have any good guitarists in our congregation, so it's not going to happen.
Yes.
Does that answer your question?
Yes, Nathan.
All right, we're going to take Nathan, we have been keeping you for a long time, and I know you have things to do, places to go. So we're going to take the last set of questions from Brother Lawrence Brown, and then we will perhaps conclude.
Right. There are a number of questions that have come in. Here's the first one. Does remaining online suggest that all or most of the members have access to the technology?
Yes, it does. We, and perhaps that reflects the fact that we are in a big wealthy city in a privileged country. There were a couple of people that didn't have immediate access to the technology to connect in. And so we made a decision as a church that we would help them get that, pay for it if need be, that we would set them up with the technology required. Because, particularly once it became clear that this was not just going to be for a few weeks, because of course, like everybody else, when we first went online, we thought it was for a few weeks. Well, this little pandemic would sort itself out in 3 or 4 weeks. That didn't turn out to be the case. And once it became clear that it was longer term, we decided as a congregation that we would help those who didn't have access to the technology to get online. That said, it's also possible to connect into a Zoom meeting by telephone. You can't see what's on the screen, obviously, but you can hear everything and you can speak. And we have one person in our congregation who still prefers to connect by telephone. Sometimes he goes to somebody else's house and joins in on the screen through their computer, like everybody else. But he actually says that for him, he often feels like he listens better and tunes in better to what people are saying when he's not distracted by the visuals. So he quite likes doing it by telephone. So for him, he has the texts of the liturgy in a booklet form in front of him while he's on the phone. So that's a much more low-tech version, but that works for him, and that's available to others. If we had somebody else who wanted to connect in that way, we would simply provide them with the booklets, and they could do that.
The next question is taking about to those first moments. How did you feel when you knew that you had to do online service?
Yeah. At the time, I think my own personal responses were a mixture of excitement and terror. I was excited because I do quite like, I personally respond to an interesting challenge. And this was an interesting challenge. And as a liturgical scholar, it was a particularly interesting challenge because I am actually trained to think about what worship means and how it works. And so the opportunity to think about how to adapt it to something we'd never tried before was a good intellectual challenge. At the same time, I was a bit terrified because, in particular, it happened at the worst possible time of the year for a liturgically oriented church. It happened 2 weeks before the beginning of Holy Week. So it was the maximum number of very different liturgies in a short space of time that it could have been at any time of the year. I had to produce the normal Sunday service for the season of Lent, followed by a Palm Sunday service, a Maundy Thursday service, a Good Friday service, an Easter Vigil, an Easter Sunday morning service, and then the normal Sundays of Easter season service. So it was 7 different liturgies in the space of less than 4 weeks to prepare. I had never used Zoom before, prior to that. I was learning it from scratch like everybody else. I had used Keynote to produce the slides, but I was needing to produce a different kind of slides because they had sound on them and so on as well, which I hadn't done before. So it was a very steep learning curve, and I worked ridiculous hours in those first weeks. There was a period of about 4 weeks where my least number of work hours for the week was 84. My most was 106, I think. Work hours for the week. That's crazy and unsustainable. If I was still doing that, I would be completely burned out by now. So it was kind of terrifying and kind of exciting at the same time. I can be a little bit of an adrenaline junkie at times. There were several of those liturgies during Holy Week where I literally finished assembling the slides 5 minutes before the liturgy began. It was kind of right down to the wire of getting it together. Crazy stuff, but we survived and we learned a lot, and it's a lot easier now. Yeah.
Okay, I think we have about 3 more questions. This one was, is it okay to lose one whole cohort? I think this had to do with the whole matter of trying to cater to everybody. Is it okay to lose one whole cohort? For example, the youths. I do believe that our offering must choose to include all.
Yeah, look, I would agree with that too. I would probably, well, it's hard to make absolute statements, so I'll say probably. I would probably never choose to make a decision that I knew cut out a particular cohort of the church unless that cohort was simply defined by taste. So if it is, if the only thing that unites the cohort is we don't like this, then I might be willing to say, well, I'm very sorry, I hope you find a church that provides what you're looking for. But if it was something that, you know, that cut out all the people who were elderly, or all the people who were under 20, or all the children, or all the people who were had limited mobility or other sort of disability kind of issues, I will always look for how can we find ways to include. And that's always been our pattern. You know, just for example, long before the pandemic, one of the things that people used to sometimes say about our worship, because we used a lot of written prayers, was, what does that mean for somebody who can't read? And the answer was, we've always had people in our worship service who can't read. Some of them are because they're young children, but we used to have a man who was in his 60s who had a mild intellectual disability, but had never really learned to read. But one of the things that we had discovered with that style of worship was that because most of it is actually the same each week, he was actually much more able to engage with it because he could memorize it over time. Whereas actually the point where he had been most cut out of worship was in the 1980s, when we stopped singing traditional hymns and started singing scripture praise choruses that kept changing every few months, constantly new, and he could never quite learn it before it was gone. And so he was actually much more engaged with us. So, and we found other ways that he could participate that didn't involve him having to read so many words. So he was the person who always lit the candle at the beginning of the worship service, and he was the person who carried in the Bible into the church when we're about to have the Bible readings and things like that. So there were physical things that happened as well that could engage him. So that's always been my emphasis, is to find ways to include people as fully as possible. But you can't always cater to people who just say, I want it my way. I'm sorry, we can't. If I do it your way, then I cut out all those other people. And it's, you know, we have to choose a path here. They're not right or wrong, but this is our path. Yeah.
Okay. Question, how is pastoral care demonstrated online?
Yeah, so again, pastoral care is one of those things that has all sorts of different dimensions to it. So sometimes pastoral care is just pastoral counselling, sitting down and having a conversation with somebody. And that can happen online. I can have a one-on-one Zoom conversation with people. And sometimes I do. I have another one of those scheduled this afternoon. That's no different from the fact that I used to do some pastoral care on telephone. Some of my pastoral conversations in the past were just on the phone rather than face-to-face. But for, like, now that we're no longer in lockdown, some of my pastoral care is face-to-face. I meet people in cafes, or I visit their homes, or and so on. So that it's a mixture. But of course, I do have some, the person I'm meeting with this afternoon doesn't live in Melbourne. He lives in the city of Adelaide, which is about 8 hours drive away. He's become part of our church. I can't go sit down in a cafe with him very easily, but we will have a conversation on Zoom. I actually find that, sometimes it has the advantage of taking the travel time out of some of those conversations. So sometimes if I'm having a 1 hour pastoral conversation with somebody and I have a half-hour drive to get to their place, that ends up being 2 hours of work time for 1 hour conversation. Zoom doesn't do that. It's 1 hour for 1 hour. So a little bit more efficient in that regard. I also find people respond differently to Zoom. Some people find it really a kind of unpleasant experience and don't like it. I personally don't have that problem. I find it quite comfortable, but there are things that you can do that make it better or worse. So for example, the psychologists tell us that one of the reasons that some people find Zoom a bit tiring and unpleasant is because they're looking at their own picture as well as other people's picture. And it makes them a bit obsessed about what they look like, and they keep looking at themselves more than they're looking at the person that they're talking with. But actually, that's easily addressed on Zoom. There's a little feature which you can all check out if you want. If those of you who've got your camera turned on can check out if you don't know. If you click on your own video box to bring up the little drop-down menu, one of the menu options is hide self-view, which means that you will no longer be seeing yourself on the screen. The rest of us will still be seeing you, but you'll no longer be seeing yourself. So I find that, especially when I'm having a one-on-one conversation, I bring up my own view so that I can make sure I'm sitting in the right place in relation to the camera and that I'm visible. And then I turn off the self view, because then all I'm seeing is the other person. And that feels like a much more natural conversation then when I'm doing that. So for those kind of conversations, that's important. Just on your pastoral care question though, there are times when there's a more embodied dimension to pastoral care. If I'm praying with somebody who's sick, I usually want to be able to lay hands on or anoint them with oil in the prayers and so on. I can't do some of those things if it's a Zoom only conversation, but we find other ways of expressing some of those things. They're not as good, but even just, with somebody where it's not a possibility, asking somebody to put their own hand on their head and just visualize me as having my hand on top of their hand as well, can be better than nothing. It's not as good as the real thing, but the real thing isn't always available.
Okay. All right. Let me see two more. Okay. One question: being largely online, what use is now primarily made of the church building?
Yeah.
And just to finish it off, there's just one more. You said you mentioned postponing or waiting for the sacrament of baptism. Have you not considered the same approach for the sacrament of the communion? Why wait where one is concerned, but not for the other?
Sure. Okay, so the question of the church building, watch this space. That's a conversation that's begun in our congregation. But as I said, it took us 15 months to decide that we were worshipping online only into the future. I expect it will take at least that long and probably longer to sort out questions about the property and what we will do with it. At the moment, we earn some income off it because our hall is hired by various other theatre groups and dance groups and Alcoholics Anonymous groups and all sorts of things during the week. So we get some income from it. We also have a car park that is leased out to a local private hospital just nearby for their staff during the week. So we're earning some income from the property, but we don't know what the long-term answer will be to how we are faithful stewards of that piece of real estate that we own. It's the area that we are located in means that it's a particularly valuable asset, and we need to consider long-term whether what we are doing is adequate stewardship. But that'll be a long conversation because we're still working out whether this new pattern of our life works. Yeah. Sorry, what was the second question? Just prompt me.
You're muted, Lawrence. I think the question has to do with why not wait for
why not the communion. Yeah. Look, that was a question that was certainly a very live question at the start when we hadn't decided whether this was a longer term pattern. And in fact, the first few weeks we did. We didn't have communion in our first 2 or 3 online worship services. But partly it was a season of Lent, which, Lent has a kind of theme of fasting anyway. So it seemed like an easy decision at that time to say, oh, let's fast from communion. But, the real reason was we were just working it out. But once we decided that this is an ongoing thing, it didn't seem like, waiting for what? What are we waiting for? If we've decided that this is a long-term practice, exactly. There isn't a point at which we go, okay, we've arrived there, we can return. Whereas with baptism, we'd only be talking about postponing it if we were in a period of hard lockdown where nobody can get together. So we actually can't get anybody else with the person who's to be baptized.
Yes.
Yeah.
Nathan, let me, on behalf of the community of churches here in Jamaica, Bethel, Buff Bay, and others here, Reverend Robbins joining us from St. James. Thank you so much for spending the time with us, for sharing.
Williams and Oracabessa,
right? So it's almost a Baptist community.
Yeah, I'm amazed how many people you've got here. This is a huge group.
And Port Maria.
Right. Hello, Port Maria. A very special place in my heart, So we want to thank you for sharing the time with us, and for sharing your experience. We're in the struggle together. It's good to know that we have Baptists in Australia, and the Baptist community in Australia have given us a little glimpse into it. I know that there are some persons who have been quite curious about your dog, who has been on the couch the whole time. He has not moved.
That dog spends a lot of time on that couch.
So I wonder if we could ask you to close in the benediction for us. I know you have I see from your liturgy, you have an Australian language. I wonder if you could close a benediction with using a local benediction so we can get a sense of the Australian.
Oh, goodness. Okay. You should have given me notice on that one.
Yeah, I should have. And I apologize. Okay. I apologize.
All right. Let me quickly think.
Yes.
Okay. This is not one that I wrote, but it's one that I can use.
Yes.
So yeah, let's just have a brief moment of silence and then I will pray. For you, people of the Caribbean, from here, a land of the great inland. For you, deep stillness of the silent inland. For you, deep blue of the desert skies. For you, strong wind of the desert breeze. For you, deep stillness, deep peace, deep love of the Son of Peace be with you all. Amen.
Amen. Thank you again, Nathan, and we hope to have another conversation at some time and reach your congregation on our behalf.
That will be an honor to be with you again another time if you would like that.
Yes.
I'm quite amazed at the number of people you have drawn. It's a strange feeling that there has been very little interest in what we have been doing from my own local denomination here in Victoria. But I go to Jamaica and 100 people turn up to talk about this.
Well, 100 on Zoom. I think we perhaps have the same 100 on YouTube, is it?
Yeah, that's right. 100 on Zoom, more.
We got up to about 108, 112.
112 on YouTube, 101 on this.
Wow.
Yes,
Okay.
So
That's extraordinary. Thank you all. I appreciate you.
So, and whenever you have it, whenever it is permitted, you can come to Jamaica, but leave the cricket team, but you can come. Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. Well, I hope to come sometime. I have friends there, and I will look forward to coming one day when travel becomes possible again.
All right. Can I ask those who are able to stay for a few more minutes? Our communications director, Brother Gary Callam, has something to share, because I think we're moving to a new link come Sunday. Gary, I wonder if you could take a few minutes and tell us what's going on here, so that people don't get lost on Sunday. Thanks, Nathan.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Nathan. Thank you.
Gary?
Okay, good evening.
Yes, it won't be long, friends, so don't worry. You'll get out before long.
No, okay, so we're not necessarily starting on Sunday, but some of you may have seen where we will be accessing our worship online in a slightly different way come during the month of December. And what I'm going to be doing right now really is to just take you through how you will do that from our website. Some persons should be familiar now with our website, bethelbaptisthwt.com, and I'm going to do a share screen and just to show you the website and how you will access the platform. Right, so here you have our website currently. And as you can see, it says, welcome to Bethel Baptist Church, come be a part of our family. For those persons who come to the website who are coming for the first time, maybe they are not members, there's a link there for I'm new. And for those who are used to the site or who come for worship online, they simply would need to click worship online, and it would take you straight through to our service that may be in process. If it is not in process, one of the challenges we have now is that until we go live with our live stream link, then there is nothing to see. One of the features that we have on this new platform is that we can allow persons to actually begin chatting. There is a chat screen that will be on the right side where you currently see the schedule for upcoming services. And what we're going to do is that we're going to allow you to be able to chat 10 minutes before the service starts. And at the end of the service, you'll have another period, maybe 5 or 10 minutes, where you can still interact with each other following the service. One of the features of this particular platform is that if at the right side at the top, there's a menu here where there's a link for past services. There is our backup stream. If something goes wrong with the stream that we have here, we have a backup stream which takes you through to our YouTube stream. The YouTube stream will still be accessible. We're not doing away with it. It will still be available. We also have a give button here for getting offering tithes and offerings online. And we also have a connect button. I'm going to click on this connect button to show you what comes up after you click on it. It takes you to our website, and it really takes you through different stages depending on what next step you may want to take. If you want to take another step, if you want to ask a question, you can do that from this page. If you are new to Bethel, you can fill out a form and it will be sent to the office, and we'll be able to follow up with that person. If you have a prayer request, you can do so right here as well. If you want to commit your life to Christ or renew your commitment to Christ, that can be done from this particular page. Let me go back to the previous page. So this is just a space that we hope will help us to fellowship a little more with each other, as it gives you the opportunity to share both before and after our worship services online. And it is our hope that we will all make use of it. I am logged in now. You can actually log in and create a profile, and we'll be able to know who our members are online. We're able to have, you can request a prayer, and someone can pray with you privately. When we have the time in our service, when we say, if you're here for the first time, a link can be placed in the chat, and that information can be privately shared. Persons wouldn't have to place their personal information in the chat. These are just some of the benefits of the new platform that we have been working on for a while now, and we trust that it will be to the benefit of all.
Right. Thank you, Brother Gary. This will not affect you Sunday, not affect your YouTube, those who watch on YouTube, and it will not and you'll be advised as we go along. Thank you, sisters and brothers, for your time and for your patience. Have a good night, and may God's peace be with all of us.
Yes, thank you. Good night. Good night.
Good night, Reverend Taylor. Good seeing you.
Yes, it sounds like Sister Faye. Good evening. Yes, here it is.
Good night, everyone.
Yes.
Night.
Bless you.
A very great blessing.